As most of you know, I'm substituting for John this morning, and the lecture he has listed will be given by him next week. This morning we are going to become involved in an extremely difficult and sticky situation, and that is the gentle subject of money. And I don't know of any way to approach this philosophically in a more interesting manner than to go back to Egypt in ancient times. We're not sure that the monetary system originated in Egypt, but it was certainly functioning there 2,000 or 3,000 B.C. And because the Egyptians were rather wise and interesting people, their opinions on this subject, while symbolical, I think is worthy of consideration. In Egypt, we are introduced to one of the earliest bankers. Now, in those days, they didn't call them bankers. They called them money changers. And this was a highly respectable occupation. In ancient times, most localities, cities, and countries had their own currencies. And when they traveled as citizens from one country to another, the individual had to change their money before they could spend it in a foreign country. So at the gate of the city was the money changer. He was seated behind a table or counter and had within his mind or in adequate notes the relative values of all currencies. And as the stranger came to the gate of the city, if he intended to spend money therein, he had to get the local currency. This was no great problem, and for the most part the system worked very well. Occasionally, however, one of these money changers misbehaved. He could do several things. Many of those who came to him to exchange their coins did not know the prevailing rates for all the communities, and it's quite conceivable that occasionally the money changer shortchanged the customer. This was considered unethical even at that time. And if a money changer was discovered to be dishonest, they took his table on which he had his various instruments and materials laid out and smashed it. Now, at that time, the table was called a bank, and it meant a table. The word bank means a table, primarily. And to break a table was to rupt it. So a dishonest money changer went bankrupt when his table was broken. And this is the origin of a term, and you can check it in the dictionary. It is still perfectly acceptable. Now, the money changer in himself was usually a good-natured soul. And for the most part, he was dominated by the religious teachings of the community in which he functioned. And so it happens that a philosophy dealing with this phase of life was developed at an early date. If a money changer was honorable, honest, and a little on the generous side, if possible, especially for the widow's mite and the coinage of the underprivileged, and the time came for him to die, he presented himself, or his soul was presented for him by the guardians of the gates of the other world, and he was taken into the hall of the great judgment, where the psychostatia ritual was performed, the judging of the souls of the dead. The judgment consisted of a court, consisting of assessors or jurors, and this is the origin of our jury system in law. And it was presided over by Osiris, the god of the afterlife, the judge of the quick and the dead. each applicant for admission into the afterlife was required to recite the negative confession of being. This negative confession has been declared to be one of the most astonishing documents in the history of mankind. And it is assumed that very few of those who appeared before the judge of the dead could possibly meet the requirements of this negative confession honestly. But as the jurors were there, and they were deities who could read the hearts and minds of men, the person under consideration had to be reasonably accurate. Now, among the 100 statements of the negative confession, the soul of the departed had to be able to say honestly that never in his life had he cheated any man. Now, that's a pretty big thing to say. He also had to say that without any question of doubt that he had been charitable, that he had helped the widow and the fatherless, and that he had used his position as money changer for the benefit of the community. He was permitted to make a small charge for the money changing, and that was all he was entitled to. Now, if he was reasonably innocent, he might well be allowed by the jurors to pass into the afterlife. If there were some doubts, but on the whole he was pretty good, then Horus, the beloved son of Osiris, interceded for the soul of the dead, saying that he would carry the punishment or bear it, and the soul should be permitted to go into the afterlife. What happened to those who failed utterly is not part of the present story, but they met a proper and appropriate reward or penalty. Having entered into the afterlife, our honest money changer was then permitted to set up his table at the gate of heaven. And those who came in from all different directions had to change their money at his table, because the coinage of the mortal world was not accepted in the heavenly region. It was of no value over there. So it had to be transformed into a medium suitable to the life beyond the grave. I think this is a very ingenious thought. And of course, what did the individual bring with him? He couldn't bring the cash. That was obvious. What was the coin that he could carry into the afterlife and have it exchanged for a blissful existence? That coinage, of course, was his own merit. The only coin that was acceptable was his own conscience, his own integrity, and his own fitness. He had to be rewarded according to his works, and he had to receive a medium of exchange that was acceptable in heaven. This, of course, gives us a very good symbolic idea. It was necessary that he have saved up his treasures for the other life. He had to come bearing the necessary symbols which entitled him to the reward which he had earned. So the transformation of the currency represented the rewarding of virtue and the changing of worldly wealth into its spiritual equivalent. This spiritual equivalent was his own character. It was his own merit and sometimes his demerit. But if he was a good man and brought his proper coinage, he received the tokens of the other world, a world beyond the grave. And he was then allowed to go in and invest or expend his accumulated spiritual wealth for the comfort and continuance of his after-death state. Now, this is interesting because it tells us a lot about psychology. The individual who was the money changer continued to be a money changer. The fact he had passed on didn't put a halo on him or crown him into the group of the celestials. He continued to live as he had lived in this world, but it was no longer a material world. It was that kind of world which the ancients considered to be a kind of sleep. A sleep. And as we learn in the soliloquy of Hamlet, in this sleep of death, what dreams may come shall give us pause. In other words, the whole thing was an internal experience. The money changer had his experience, if he was honest. He continued to do the things he was fitted to do. He continued to build his experiences from the previous life, and he would carry forward into the next life the merits and the internal spiritual experience and maturity which he had gained through honest dealing. This type of thought brings us very much into the psychological area, namely that success and failure, wealth and poverty, justice, reward and penalty, are mysterious experiences of the inner life, the life which we all must face between embodiments, and our condition is determined by ourselves. When a farmer entered into the great Amentet, the Elysian fields of the blessed, he did not become a politician or a philosopher or a theologian. He was given a beautiful allotment of land, and here he was also given a spirit oxen to work the field, and he worked it with a plow, and the celestial Nile never failed to irrigate his land, and he became a happy and well-adjusted farmer, because that was what he was. Now, this does not mean that all life ends in farming. It means, however, that all life is a rewarding for accomplishment, and the individual being permitted by his own virtue to fulfill his own life constructively, beautifully, and unselfishly. This was the law of Egypt. This was the concept behind the development of a belief in the exchange of worldly goods. Now, on a more prosaic and more material level, we also know that the Egyptians had their own way of handling barter. Barter was the earliest form of exchange, and barter was the basis of our monetary system. In very ancient times, barter was an exchange of like for like, in value if not in commodity. If a man had a flock of sheep, and he wished to barter one or more of these sheep for something else that he needed or wanted, he went to the common market, and in many countries even today, barter is very largely the basis of all transactions. So he would drive a couple of sheep to town and exchange them for a cow or for clothing or for whatever he needed. Now, there's one point in this that's very important. In the barter system of that time, it was up to the original owner to protect the value of that which he hoped to exchange for something else. If the farmer, anxious to make a few extra dollars, did not feed his sheep, and they came scraggly and poor and thin into the market, he would get very little for them, because they were not kept up. And therefore, it was up to him to make sure that his collateral was in good condition. And if he took proper care of his own goods, then it could be exchanged for goods of equal quality. This placed a kind of censorship upon all transaction, because if the sheep was not properly cared for, it was simply not a serviceable instrument of exchange. When a wealthy Egyptian decided to buy something, he went to the